I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and allow me to welcome you to Being and Logos, an introduction to Middle-Platonism. This seminar hopes to explore the philosophical foundations, especially in metaphysics, at the heart of Western philosophy following the death of Plato and before the rise of Plotinus in Neo-Platonism. But really importantly, this seminar is an example, an experiment really, in crowd-funded university-level education. No paywalls, no subscriptions, no fees, just here's a class for free. And that's only really possible through the generous support of my Patreon. If you want to support this project, please consider taking a look down below at the links for my Patreon. But otherwise, I'm honored to welcome you to this course as we explore the fascinating philosophical developments at the very heart, at the very origin of Christianity, of Hermeticism, of Gnosticism, and the foundations of Western Esotericism. Welcome to Being and Logos. All right, everyone. Well, with great pleasure and some trepidation, I'm really happy to begin our exploration of Middle-Platonism, a topic that on the surface sounds incredibly boring when you call it Middle-Platonism. It's just sort of the middle between the old and the new. And of course, with the Neo-Platonism getting most of the attention, I feel like that Neo-Platonism, or Middle-Platonism rather, doesn't get nearly enough attention. But with great thanks to the patrons of this channel, I'm happy to begin the first lecture of our course, Being and Logos, an introduction to Middle-Platonism. And a little bit about why this course. And we always start, I think, when we think about Plato with the famous quote by the founder of process philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead, who famously declared that the safest generalization or characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato. And this is an oft quoted and patently true statement about basically all of Western civilization, is that, or the thought of Western civilization is that it is a series of footnotes to Plato. But this should actually inspire deeper philosophical reflection. And one of the things that it should immediately raise into deeper philosophical reflection is, what do we mean by Plato? What teachings do we mean specifically? And what is Platonism? It's certainly the case that we think we all know what Platonism is. We have a general idea about what Platonism is. But the problem is that once you begin to interrogate the nature of Platonism itself, the thought of Plato, all kinds of monkey wrenches begin to be thrown into the mix of what we think we know. And as we probe into that, we're going to start that process today, is that even the things that we read in the dialogues that all of us take for granted as being Platonism, those might not be Platonism at all. And so this is a problem that we face as we begin to dive into Middle-Platonism. What is Middle-Platonism? Is it the case that Plato died and then bequeathed a series of dogmas that were meant to be defended as a kind of orthodoxy? Or is it something much more amorphous, which is to say Plato is, you're defending Plato and the thought of Plato in a much more abstract way, as opposed to specifically a set of orthodoxies that become Platonism? So that's one of the big problems. The second problem that we're going to encounter is, what are those earliest footnotes? Because if we take seriously that the earliest footnotes, to use the language of Whitehead here, it's footnotes to Plato, if those earliest footnotes are people that actually studied at the feet of Plato, we should take their voices very seriously. They learned directly from the guy. I mean, imagine if we had something similar with Jesus, that we had a dozen books written by people who actually sat at the foot of Jesus. We would take their books very seriously. What's interesting is that we all admit to the centrality of Plato, and what do we not do? We don't take the admittedly fragmentary evidence of what became Western philosophy. We don't take those people closest to Plato, with the exception of one person, that of course being Aristotle. We don't take those footnotes, those earliest footnotes, terribly seriously. So one of the questions that we need to get at are, what are those earliest footnotes? Who are those earliest people studying in the academy? And what do they reveal to us about what this idea of Platonism is? And lastly, do we have fidelity in those texts to Plato? Do the inheritors of Plato and Platonism represent his thought, or do they represent some other kind of trajectory of what became Middle Platonism in a general way? So we have two questions here. One, does Plato express a coherent set of ideas, a coherent set of philosophical notions in the texts that we have that survive. So is there a Platonism? And put it even more spicily, was Plato a Platonist? That's a good question to ask. And so we have that question, and then we have this other secondary question of what do the earliest footnotes to Plato look like? What are these earliest people who studied under Plato? What are they doing, and what does their thought look like? So this seminar is going to wrestle with, I hope, these kinds of questions. This is going to be us taking a look at the closest people around Plato and the echoes of their thought and the echoes of Plato's thought reaching all the way into the Roman imperial period, knocking on the door of what we might call Neo-Platonism. So this brings us to the uninteresting named Middle-Platonism, the world of Middle-Platonism. And we see here a fragment of Philo of Alexandria here on the screen. But why? Why be interested in Middle-Platonism? Well, it's a very germane topic for what we do here at Esoterica. And I would suggest, and I would forward, that it's also just germane for doing the history of philosophy. If we're going to be doing the history of philosophy, we should do it as Peter Adamson has. We should do it with as few gaps or no gaps as possible. But there's even a more specific reason why Middle Platonism matters for the kind of stuff that we do here at Esoterica. It's because this material has been, one, pretty systematically understudied, and therefore has a kind of esoteric element. In fact, we're going to get immediately into some of those esoteric elements today. And secondly, Middle Platonism has had an overwhelmingly powerful impact on the development of religion, and especially the development of what we would call esoteric religion. And while Neo-Platonism is most strongly associated, for instance, with the development of the Western mystical tradition and the Eastern mystical tradition, that is to say the Greek Eastern mystical tradition, it was Middle Platonism that most directly influenced the development of things like Hermeticism, of Gnosticism, of early Christianity and people like Origen, the development of Hellenistic astrology and magic, the metaphysics, the mechanics of how all of that worked in the mind of all of those Greek magical papyri, the machinery of that, insofar as it has an intellectual foundation, that machinery is Middle Platonism. Ditto with people like Zosimus and things like the development of alchemy, but also, again, things like the Chaldean oracles. Recall, we have a kind of weird causality, temporality when it comes to the development of mysticism and other kinds of ideas, where in some ways we say Neoplatonism sort of backwards influenced all of this earlier material. And of course, Neoplatonism doesn't even emerge until the 3rd century. And most of the material that we are interested in here, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Christianity, that's all being influenced by Middle Platonism. So if you care about the development, and I imagine most of us do around here, about the development of Christianity, development of esoteric Judaism, the development of to some degree of Islam, but certainly magic and alchemy and astrology and these sort of things, those are all born out of the world of Middle Platonism. So this also explains to me, at least to some degree, why this field is so badly understudied. I think it's badly understudied precisely because of the kind of things that we are interested in. It's so associated with this sort of what Dylan calls the Platonic underground, the world of the Hermetica, the world of the Chaldean oracles, the world of astrology and alchemy, where they're just as concerned about the nature of the daimones as they are other kinds of philosophical problems. And if they're interested in these questions of things like the daimones, well, I think that's germane for the study of something like magic, certainly for the study of something like astrology. And those are going to be the kind of topics that we're going to see developing in the later Middle Platonists. So I think it's actually this connection with, again, what Dylan calls the Platonic underworld, that this material doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And of course, being that it doesn't get the attention that it deserves is all the more reason why we would turn to it and study it here at Esoterica. So this is another justification, right? So the two basically are, we should be doing the history of philosophy honestly and completely. The Middle Platonists should be just as part of that as the early Platonists or the Neoplatonists. And two, it's especially germane for the kind of stuff that we do here at Esoterica. So let's think about the intellectual context of Plato. What is Plato trying to do? And what I'm going to forward to you is that Plato's mind, like all great minds, is trying to solve a problem. That we inherit philosophical problems from our ancestors, and we're always trying to solve problems, whether it's Leibniz or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. We're handed a bowl full of paradoxes and we're trying to work them out. And all of philosophy is at some level trying to negotiate with these kinds of problems. And the problem that I see being inherited by Plato, the problem that militates Platonism, the emergence of Platonism as we know it, is a debate between two philosophers in the region, in the generations prior to Plato. And that is the debate between the Eleatics, represented primarily by people like Parmenides, and Heraclitus. And as you'll famously remember, it is Heraclitus that makes the argument that all things are flux, all things flow, pantare, all things flow, and therefore exact knowledge of anything becomes impossible. If things are constantly in a state of flux, which if we look around and look at anything in the world, everything does seem to be in a constant state of flux. You can't step into the same river twice because it's not the same river and you're not the same person. So this generates a problem, an epistemological problem. If things are constantly changing, how can anything be known? How can anything be knowable if nothing can be the object of analysis? Because as soon as you analyze a thing, it's already become something else. All right, so this creates a bit of a nightmare, and certainly it's backed up by the senses. The senses seem to observe a world that is in fact constantly changing. On the other side of the fence, we have Parmenides. And of course, Parmenides, in his incredibly important book on truth and opinion, he claims that a divine goddess has revealed to him the nature of reality, and that reality is in fact a being, full stop. Reality is simply being. And of being, there is no change, because if it were change, it would no longer be being, it would be something else. And being, therefore, is not subject to alteration, and it is not subject to temporal succession or time. Being simply is. What is, and the appearance that we have, our opinions that we get primarily from our sense data, those are just wrong. We are experiencing a constant delusion. Change is an illusion, and what is really real is that we are in being, and being is static. Now, the upshot of this is that we can know things. We can derive all kinds of things, or at least a limited number of things, for which we can be sure. We can be analytically sure. And it is, in fact, we think of Parmenides as a person who invents, or I would actually say it is revealed to him, the nature of metaphysics. Parmenides is our first true metaphysician, certainly our first true analytic metaphysician. And you can actually formulate his arguments in an analytical form, in a formal form, as I've done on an episode on Parmenides. But this seems to completely contradict the data we get from our senses. We don't experience a world of unchanged. We don't experience a world that is static. We experience a world that is constantly changing. So this produces a trifecta of problems. One of the problems is a metaphysical problem, which is true. Are things constantly changing, or are they not? The second is an epistemological question. If things are changing, what can be known about them, if anything? And if they're not, does the knowledge that there is being, simplicator, is this trivial or not? So there's an epistemological question. And finally, there's an axiological question. What are we to do with this in terms of values? Right? How are we to live our lives? How do we live our lives? How is it that we live our lives if being is all there is and everything I'm experiencing around me is a kind of persistent delusion? And secondly, how do I become an ethical person if fundamentally at some level, if I take a loan out from you, right? I take a loan out from you and you come back and ask me to pay it back, and I say, oh, no, I'm not paying it back. And you're like, why not? Well, because, you're not the same person, and I'm not interested in, paying this back. So you can see why there are metaphysical, epistemological, and axiological problems that come around with the question around Heraclitus and the question around Parmenides. Plato, in many ways, unlike Socrates does not care about these problems. For Socrates, the question is how to find the truth in a religious sense of duty, and one does it through a process of asking questions. And for him, it's a question of how to live a good life. Plato more directly inherits this problem from Heraclitus and Parmenides. In his solution, at least the apparent solution that we all tell ourselves is the solution that he gives,
is that he posits two worlds. He posits a world of being, right? And in the world of being, it is unchanging and static. The world of being is unchanging and static, and therefore true things can be known about it. And in fact, for Plato, truth is only possible because of the realm of being. And yet, there is also a parallel world, right? Or a singular unified world in a very strange sense of becoming, where things are constantly changing and where sense data is bombarding us and we are seeing things change, but nothing can be known about this world. Rather, right, we are, the human being is the nexus of these two worlds. We are enmeshed in the world of becoming, in the physical shape of our body, in the hule that is our body, and the senses that we gather, the data we gather from our senses. But also we are a soul, and our soul can remember the forms that existed before we were born into a physical body. And as we remember the forms, we can see that things in the sensible world, in the world of hule, in the world of matter, they participate in the forms. And insofar as they participate in the forms, we can know, or we can approach some knowledge of what is going on in this world. So this is Plato's famous solution for how to square this circle. And of course, he dumps out a metaphysics, he dumps out an epistemology, right? The epistemology of remembering, and he dumps out an axiology in terms of how to live a good life. And this, I would argue, is fundamentally the solution of the way Plato squares the circle between Heraclitus and Parmenides. But if you think about this, even for a moment, there's a lingering question. Where did the forms come from? Where did the things that populate the realm of being, where did those forms come from? And if they're eternal, what do we can say about their eternality? Where did souls come from? Why are souls, at least human souls, enmeshed in hule and matter and not the forms? How did we get here? Where does matter come from? Was it eternally here, right? And so we have questions that emerge about first principles here. Plato is giving us a really elegant solution to a problem, but in some sense, he's kicking the can down the road because he's not giving us a first principles story about where this comes from. And then he does. In his book, the Timaeus, he does give us a story. Now, the term he uses for the story is an oikos logos, a likely narrative, a likely story. He never calls it a myth, but he calls it a likely story. And also he puts it in the mouth of someone else. So this question, and we can rehearse the Timaeus at some length, but in this in the likely story of the Timaeus, what we have is a kind of primeval demiurge whose emergence is never clear to us. We don't know where the demiurge comes from. We see the demiurge look toward the forms and attempt to, in his goodness or its goodness, their goodness, I don't know what gender the demiurge has, it attempts to impress those forms into matter. And as the demiurge presses them into matter, there's an imperfect fit. The forms are perfect, matter is imperfect. The forms don't change, matter is changeable. And therefore, the world that we get is in some sense a shadow of the perfection of the forms. And in that, we ultimately generate the world of the soul, we generate individual souls, and ultimately through a kind of metaphysics of geometry, we began to build the universe out of a series of triangles. And building up, we get the Platonic solids, and ultimately that leads to the world of sensibilia. Now, there are tons of problems about the Timaeus. And one of them is, should this story be taken literally? And we know, as we'll get into Middle Platonism, some people took it literally and some people took it figuratively. Aristotle, for instance, insisted that it should be taken literally, that Plato literally believed this was what happened. There's problems with that. We know that Aristotle was in the academy for 30 years, so he does know what he's talking about. He's also not a terribly reliable narrator because he's a rival to the academy at this point. So is he telling the truth, or is he at some level attempting to undermine Plato as taking a metaphorical story literally when it was never meant to be taken like that? Secondly, we have other questions like, when does this happen in time? You know, is it the fact that the demiurge is creating something in time, or is this an eternal process that's always been happening? A lot hinges on that philosophically, whether the demiurge is acting eternally or in time. a great deal of the questions can emerge if you've ever read the Timaeus, which I would certainly hope that you do in the course of this seminar, because so much is going to hinge on the one's reading of the Timaeus. A further question is it the case that the documents that we have from Plato even represent his authentic thought? Do the dialogues, which we all love and cherish, are they actually representative of what he thought? And now we get into the thorniest of all questions, and thank the gods, though I'm dealing with it now at the very beginning of the seminar, because I don't want to deal with it later. I'm going to get it out of the way, and we'll say what we need to say about it and move on, because it will continue to haunt us the entire time of this seminar, is the question, of course, of what is called the agrapha dogmata, the unwritten doctrines of Plato. This is, without any doubt, the thorniest topic in Plato studies. I'm going to give you a version of it that I think is reasonable. Your mileage may vary. It will certainly vary. Everyone seems to have a strong opinion about the agrapha dogmata. That phrase, by the way, comes from Aristotle, right? Aristotle's going to comment in the Physics and Metaphysics about ideas that we don't see really apparently in Plato's dialogues, and he's going to say these are the agrapha, the so-called agrapha dogmata, the unwritten doctrines of Plato. So what are our sources for this? And just to be clear, I'm not going to wade into the waters of the tubing in Milano school versus other people that have all kinds of beliefs about this. I'm going to say the consensus around the unwritten doctrines, as much as there is a consensus around it, is going to look mostly like what I'm going to present. And then every single thing I'm going to present here could be challenged and would be challenged by Plato scholars. And so I'm giving a kind of gestalt of what we think the unwritten doctrines were, if they were at all. So what are our sources for the unwritten doctrines? The first is the famous seventh letter of Plato. This seventh letter is disputed. Some people think that it's authentic. Some people think that it's not. So I don't know. I tend to believe it's authentic, and stylometric analysis of it also seems to confirm that it is, in fact, Platonic. It certainly sounds a lot like the way Plato writes. So the famous seventh letter. We'll come back to the seventh letter in just a minute. The next, of course, is the famous report of Aristoxenus, which is also only preserved in Aristotle. So we have this, second, third hand. Again, Aristotle is hostile to the Academy, but this is the famous report of Aristoxenus, where at the end of his life, Plato is going to give a public lecture on the good, and people show up hoping to hear a lecture on how to live a good life, and Plato lectures for hours on geometry. So what is this, right? With math and geometry seem to be playing a big role in this, as we'll see in just a minute, but this seems to be congruent with the kind of things that Aristotle and other documents say as well. Further, we have what I call the contentions of Aristotle. Aristotle seems to know a doctrine about the fundamental nature of reality that we do not find expressed in the dialogues. And again, I don't think he's making it up. I think that he's arguing with it precisely because it's the position that Plato took. And therefore, we can, again, with some degree of hesitancy, say that Aristotle is representing Plato, at least to some degree accurately, in order to argue with him. So we have the contentions found in especially the physics and the metaphysics of Aristotle. We also have Plato's own critique of writing. You'll know from many documents in Plato that Plato at some level thinks that writing is bad for us and that truth cannot be written down, that there's something about the nature of truth that cannot be captured in writing, and that one attempts to do it, one fails, and perhaps even perverts the truth. And therefore, there are the famous warning of Thoth that it will destroy memory, it will destroy experience, that experience will be brought onto the bus, and therefore there are Plato's own critiques of writing. There's also what the Tübingen school calls the doctrine of the reserve. The reserve is where, in the dialogues, Plato will introduce what seemingly is a crucially important metaphysical doctrine, and then pass it over without explaining it. It seems as if Plato is flagging to his students in the dialogues, oh yeah, we talked about this in class, right? Or we talked about this over in the academy, or we talked about this at, over lunch or something. So it seems like Plato is flagging the viewer that something important is happening, and letting them know it's not in the book. So this is what is called the doctrine of the reserve. The other elements of this is one that Plato himself even refers to the dialogues as the spoudia paideia, the entertainments. He refers to them as entertainments. As at some level, they're kind of a teaching tool that's meant to be entertaining, sort of like edutainment. Maybe we've been doing edutainment since all the way back in the days of Plato. But there's a kind of discounting of the dialogues by Plato himself. He's saying these are for public consumption, but they're not the real thing. The real teachings are something else. So we have this idea that they are spoudia paideia. So maybe they're not exactly, again, what Plato really believed and really taught in the academy. And lastly, among many other things we can talk about, is that the trajectory of the academy, and we'll begin talking about the old academy in our next lecture, the trajectory of the old academy is not in the direction of the forms. Speusippus, we learned from Aristotle, Speusippus is the next scholarch after Plato dies. Speusippus just rejects the doctrine of the forms. Just rejects it. He just doesn't have any, he thinks it's either useless or redundant. He, weirdly enough, agrees with Aristotle about this. And so there's a clearly something going on in the trajectory of the academy. And again, if we think Plato's actual teachings are putting wind in the sails of the trajectory, the intellectual trajectory of the academy, then it doesn't look like the stuff that we see in the Republic. It doesn't look like even the stuff that we see in the Parmenides. It must have been something different. And as we get to Speusippus next time, you'll see that it is radically unlike the Plato that all of us have come to know and love. It's a very, very, very different Plato. But just to give you some sense of what I mean here, if we look at the seventh letter, this is a very interesting argument, and I'm cleaning this argument up a bunch. If you go read the seventh letter, and you especially look at it in Greek, it is tortured. It is not clear what Plato is talking about. What I want to give to you is what I think is a good reconstruction of what the argument is there. But what he's arguing for is that he's talking about the tyrant in Syracuse, and he says the tyrant in Syracuse has written a document, has claimed to have written a document on metaphysics that claims, or on being, that is better than the teaching of Plato. And Plato says, if he's written on metaphysics, he can't be better than me, because any written document about metaphysics is inherently wrong. Why? If you want to know what a thing is in its essence. If you want to know what a thing is in itself, the essence of a thing, really pure metaphysics, metaphysical knowing, there are 5 things that one has to know about it or have knowledge of in order to know what that thing is. That is to say, if you want to have what we might call justified true belief, or to know it in Greek, and the word here is gnoston, right? You have knowledge of what is cognizable and true. You need to know the name of a thing. So you need to be able to isolate it out from every other thing in the world by knowing its specific name. You need to have its logos, right? An account of it. That is to say, a kind of definition of it. You need to have a definition of it that is precise enough to capture what that thing is, but not broad enough that it would capture anything else. It needs to precisely define what that thing is. When these two things are combined, right, this becomes known as its quality. So the name of it plus its logos becomes its poion, its quality. And when you do that through discursive analysis. So when I want to know what a book is, I do discursive analysis of it. I can know its name. I can call it a book. This is different than a scroll. It's different than, a roll. It's different than something else. I can get a name for it. I can define it by saying it's pieces of bound paper, which there's a cover or something, right? You can debate about this, of course, to no end, and we know that the academics did. That tells me its poion, its quality. And we get all of that through sense perception, right? And also when I get sense perception of it, I can see it. So that brings us up to what Plato calls knowledge, episteme. So I have justified true belief about a book when I arrive at those 4 things, right? Justified true belief at that point. But Plato says that to achieve the knowledge of the essence of it, episteme to a knowledge of the being, the pure being of the book, this transcends discursive analysis, and it transcends sensible analysis. because no amount of talking will ever exhaustively give me the being of the book, and no amount of looking at it, sensing it, feeling it, hearing it will ever give me the essence of the book. Rather, the only way to do that is to have a direct apperception of bookness, right? To have what he calls the fifth, and he never names it. He just calls it the fifth. And this direct apperception of the book only is given to me in flashes. It's the kind of thing that I only get in sort of a bolt of Gnostic bliss. But that bolt of Gnostic bliss, you can throw as much words at it as you want. You can throw as much sensibility at it as you want, but you will never get the the essence of the book, no matter how much you write about it, nor how much you sense it, because the essence is beyond discursive analysis and beyond sensible analysis. And therefore, any metaphysics that can be written down, any metaphysics that can be taught, isn't metaphysics. And I know that people out there being like, that sounds like Taoism. Kind of it does, right? It has that. The Tao that can be taught is not the Tao. The being that can be taught is not the being. You cannot write it down, and anyone who claims to have written it down, you can know they're wrong, just by virtue of them having written it down. So this is the argument as much as we understand it from the seventh letter. Now, again, think about what Plato is doing in the Republic or in the Parmenides. He's trying to talk about essences. And so the question is there something esoteric happening in the Platonic teachings? Is there something dissimulative happening where there's a kind of popular metaphysics that Plato is giving the hoi polloi? But the truth of the matter is, really to know the being of something, there has to be sort of this fifth essence, this fifth way of knowing that is at some level one might call mystical, for lack of a better words. What's happening here? How do we line up with clearly Plato doing metaphysics in the Parmenides, especially, and in other documents like the Republic? Although, again, in the Phaedrus, recall, he will say things like the only really way to get to truth is how? Through the mania. Only through the mania of love, or through the prophetic mania. That's how we really get to the truth. But again, Western philosophy has greatly ghettoized those thoughts. Why? Because we want Plato to be our logical guy. We don't want him to be a weird mystic. Certainly not advocating knowledge through mysticism in the seventh letter, or direct apperception, we might say, in the seventh letter, much less in the Phaedrus or the mania. So the seventh letter is telling us, if it's accurate, and we put that into dialogue, in dialogue with the Phaedrus, we have a coherent belief that says true knowledge of metaphysics is only had through some kind of profound altered state of consciousness that is not discursive and it is not sensible, right? But Aristotle is going to make all of this very uncomfortable for us, because that's what Aristotle likes to do. He likes to take everything that it seems to be obvious and make it very strange. Aristotle gives us what seems to have been Plato's fundamental metaphysics, what we might call his fundamental ontology, or we might call what they called Plato's first principles. Now, again, can we trust this? I don't know. Aristotle was notoriously hostile to the academy, but he was there for 30 years. So, and also later on, when people come to defend Plato against Aristotle, never to my knowledge do they say, oh, Aristotle, you misunderstood Plato, or you're making stuff up, or Plato never taught that. They go white knuckle it. They are defending the doctrine that's laid out by Aristotle as Platonic, as the teaching of Plato, in a way that seems like they agree that this is in fact what Plato taught. So let's unpack this, what might be an element of the Agrapha Dogmata of Plato. The main thing you'll notice here is that the theory of the forms, which we all take to be the doctrine of the mature Plato, certainly the Plato of the Republic, although it certainly comes into question by the later Plato, the Plato of the Parmenides, which many people think, by the way, is, in that text, folks may know this, that in the early dialogues, Socrates ends everything in an aporia. There's no settled answer. In the middle dialogues, we think we're hearing the teachings, at least the popular teachings of Plato in the middle dialogues, in the mouth of Socrates. So now Socrates famously, or rather shockingly, knows stuff. And of course, Socrates' claim to fame was that he didn't. But now in the middle dialogues, like the Republic, he certainly knows stuff, and he's arguing with people about the nature of justice. In the later dialogues, the interlocutor is tripping up Socrates. And most famously, we have this in the Parmenides, where Parmenides comes and talks to Socrates, who is very young in this dialogue. Parmenides is quite old, and he drills Socrates of, is there a form of hair and dirt and mud? This is famous, and he just really shatters the theory of the forms. So there is a diminution. There is a sense in which the forms are not doing the heavy lifting that they were doing, for instance, in the Republic, but rather we have two more primitive metaphysical principles. The first principle that we have, and I should say that these are all mathematical in character. The overwhelming consensus is that Plato, toward the end of his career, or maybe always, maybe in the esoteric teachings, the unwritten doctrines, is always in this position, is that he has become a Pythagorean. That his positions begin to look like, again, the fragmented stuff that we have, but Platonism and Pythagoreanism absolutely cannot be separated in what might be the Agrapha Dogmata, and certainly by later Middle Platonists. So if you hear a lot of Pythagoreanism here, it's because Plato probably was beginning to embrace, or always embraced, a form of Pythagoreanism here. And in that way, we might conclude that there is no such thing as Platonism. There's just Plato's peculiar version of Pythagoreanism. I know that's kind of a mic drop moment, but might not be Platonism. There is no Platonism. There is only Pythagoreanism. That seems to be perhaps an argument that can be made. But in this Pythagoreanized version of Plato, or Plato being a good Pythagorean, everything begins with two principles. The first is the one, right? The one is the first principle, and then accompanying the one in a sort of primitive ontological state is what is usually referred to as the indefinite dyad, what Aristotle claims Plato called the great and the small. And the one is a kind of active limiting principle. It acts to put a limit on what is otherwise limitless, the apeiron, and this one actively limits the indefiniteness of the dyad. It imposes, right, limits, peros, on the apeiron. And this, by limiting the principle of the apeiron, it provides one with solidity, like things can come out of it, and it is the principle by which things are become individuated. So individuation is the process of the one limiting the great and the small. The dyad, on the other hand, the indefinite dyad, is responsible for extensibility. That is to say, variation, magnitudes, and change. The indefinite dyad represents the world of becoming, one might say. It is the thing that is constantly sort of vibrating in terms of the great and the small. It is always polarizing, seesawing between the great and the small. It generates magnitudes, it generates extension, it generates the world that we might recognize. What we have is the one imposing limit, peros, on the indefinite dyad. And this produces the tension between unitary beings that are individuated and the fact that those individuated entities exist in a world of magnitudes, right? I am smaller than so-and-so. I am larger than so-and-so. I am older than so-and-so. I am in this place and now I'm in this place. These two principles, the one and the indefinite dyad, generate the conditions upon which individuation can occur, but also change. Again, solving that great debate between Pythagoras, or rather solving that great debate between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Further, out of this relationship of the limiter, the one and the indefinite dyad, there is a extension of what is called primal mathematicals. The first thing that emerges in this imposition of the one on the indefinite dyad are the primal mathematicals. Now, the primal mathematicals are sometimes referred to as formal numbers. Formal numbers are oneness, two-ness, three-ness, four-ness, five-ness, etc. Now, you cannot add oneness to get two-ness. Two-ness is an individually discrete metaphysical entity. You cannot add, and get this from Aristotle, the formal numbers are not addable in the way that the mathematical numbers aren't addable, the mathematical arithmetic numbers. But it is the case that any given instantiation of a one, which is added to another one to produce two, is only able to do that insofar as it participates in some way in the oneness of the formal numbers. So mathematical numbers are derivative of formal numbers. So we have at first generated the mathematicals. And from this numericality, from these mathematicals, the formal ones give rise to the regular ones that we all use to do arithmetic. And this is where geometry emerges. From oneness emerges a point. From two-ness emerges a line. Right? And again, this is all bound up in Euclidean stuff where you cannot say that a line is simply an infinitely compressed point, because that's not thinkable. But rather, the position here is oneness generates a point, two-ness generates lines, three-ness generates planes, and four-ness generates solids. You'll remember this, again, from the Timaeus. It never quite says that, but you can easily see why in the Timaeus you might come to such a position. And of course, you add 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, right? And you end up with the decad and the tetrachus in Pythagoreanism. The one I'm showing you on the screen right now is from Jakob Böhme, and you can see how this is going to directly influence Western esotericism, very much clearly influencing Western esotericism. The container of these numericals, of these mathematicals, the container of this is referred to as a topos. It's some kind of place. And generally speaking, we think that topos, that place, is the world soul. The world soul is just the name for the place in which the primal mathematicals are generated. So that's just, the world soul is just that place. The human soul, of course, is a microcosm of that world soul. We'll talk about more in a minute. But what happens is that world soul impresses form upon primeval matter, which has always been there, and from that emerges the cosmos. So world soul and the demiurge of Timaeus are the same entity. The world soul and the demiurge of Timaeus are just the exact same entity according to Aristotle. What's interesting about this is that Aristotle contends that the Timaeus is a rubbish story, because the Timaeus seems to contend that this happened at one point in time. And of course, Aristotle famously rejects the idea that there is a creation. For Aristotle, the world is eternal. And what's interesting is that Aristotle's cosmic eternalism will be later applied to the demiurge story by almost all Platonists, and therefore we will have an Aristotelianized, eternalized version of the Timaeus story. Because if you read the Timaeus story, it reads very much like a kind of creation from nothing. And that's the reason why early Christians preserved it in the Latin West, because it looks so much like the Genesis creation story. The Christians read it as creation from nothing. Aristotle read it, or Aristotle said that's precisely why it's nonsense. But how did it get saved? Platonists applied Aristotelian eternalism to the Timaeus and said it's eternally happening. So the bizarre history of how this stuff is going to go. So Platonists use the opponent of the Timaeus to save the Timaeus. So this is the way things will emerge in this text. And if you know your Gnostic mythology, right, the Gnostic mythology leans on the Timaeus story, also making it very much a moment in time, as much as time. We can apply concepts like time to this. The human being, according to this theory, is a microcosm of the macrocosm. So again, we're already beginning to see how doctrines like microcosm, macrocosm mirroring that we're going to see predominate in Hermeticism and ultimately in Western Esotericism. These ideas are already to be found in Ovo, already back in these sort of these unwritten these unwritten doctrines of Plato. But in the unwritten doctrines, unlike the divided line that we have in the Republic, this tends to result in the human soul being, again, the nexus of the world of being and the world of becoming in the form of matter. And we then get, again, a kind of layered knowledge of the world from direct apprehension, which is nous. And again, think back to the seventh letter. And if you really want to know something according to the seventh letter, you can only have it through direct apprehension. Here, this is referred to as nous. Discursive knowledge, which is episteme, belief or opinion. I like the translation belief better, of doxa. And then, of course, sense perception in the form of aesthesis. So aesthesis being most down the line in terms of what we get from the senses, and therefore the least reliable, all the way up through belief, doxa, discursive knowledge in the form of episteme, and eventually direct apperception in nous. Exactly, again, what the seventh letter says. So the seventh letter is agreeing, right, with the Agraphata Dogmata. It seems to be agreeing with what Aristotle says Plato believed. So again, this is where we get weird stuff, because none of this really agrees with what we see in the official dialogues. None of this totally agrees with the Parmenides. None of it totally agrees with the Republic. None of it really agrees with a lot of that material. So now, again, we can also dump out axiology out of this. Remember, this is not just an epistemological problem. It's not just a metaphysical problem. It is an axiological problem. And what is the axiology? What does Plato famously say via Socrates that philosophy is? It's preparation for death. The physical body is going to die. And therefore, the task of what one needs to do is one needs to learn the fundamental nature of reality. And this gives us the logical result of how we do that. We do it through diaresis. Diaresis is the method of division. You divide things into their appropriate name, again, their appropriate kind of quality, and it is by separating things out you eventually learn what things are. Through this process of division, the diaresis, one can ultimately come to know the truth. This is, in some sense, a logical development of the elenchus. Again, the elenchus in Socrates' mouth was either X or Y, but not both, right? We have the same thing usually applied by Socrates for figuring out how to live a good life. We have that same mechanism being applied to metaphysics. So we have, at some level, the logical mirror of the cosmic process of division by which the cosmic order, the cosmos, was generated, I suppose. And of course, this also has axiological results in the form of eudaimonia. What is a good life? A good life is dividing between extremes. It is dividing between the correct balance of extremes. It is limiting the great and the small. You don't want to have too little of this and too much of that. By limiting the great and the small, you sail through the middle, and ultimately you can have a good life. Now, I know what everyone is thinking right now. That sounds exactly like Aristotle. That sounds like the Nick ethics all day long, that it is about moderating between extremes. It is surprising to you, should it be surprising to you, that Aristotle is arriving at a position about axiology informed by the secret teachings of Plato? Of course not. Because what was he? He was a student of Plato for 30 years. The axiology of Aristotle is directly the result of the axiology of Plato. Again, if we accept this as the so-called hidden documents or hidden doctrines or esoteric doctrines, secret doctrines or whatever of Plato, we should not expect the apple to fall far from the tree. And the reason for that is very easy, is again very easy to understand. It's because Aristotle is probably just expressing orthodox Platonism. And surprise, surprise, when we get to Speusippus and Polemon and Xenocrates and other people from the academy, they have the exact same axiological theory. We should not say that Aristotle's theory of ethics, right, was this. We should simply say this was what Plato taught in the academy, and Aristotle simply took it over. He gets the credit for it, mostly because those hidden doctrines remain very much hidden to us. But again, we're left with more mysteries than not here, right? Again, I mentioned the famous lecture on the good, that when asked about the good life, what did Plato do? He gave a lecture on the mathematics. He gave a lecture on geometry, which sounds weird at first, and it is weird, but it's only weird if you don't think about it in terms of this metaphysical first principles of the imposition of the one on the indefinite dyad. The mathematics underwrites the axiology. The mathematicals underwrite the cosmology. The mathematicals underwrite the epistemology, the metaphysics, the ontology, and the axiology. And so, unsurprisingly, we have this very late, admittedly quite late statement that famously was hung above the academy, that let no one enter that does not know geometry. Let no geometers in the academy. Why? Because the universe is geometrical. Geometry is the universe. At some level, if you don't understand geometry, you're not going to do well in the Platonic Academy, because that just is what they're doing. This is clearly a Pythagorean development inside of the academy, only recognizable if you look at it through the lens of what were allegedly these unwritten doctrines of Plato. But as we come to the end today, if it is the case that all of European philosophy consists of series of footnotes to Plato, we must ask, what are those footnotes, and what are they footnotes to? Are they footnotes to the Parmenides and the Republic, or are they footnotes to something much, much more mysterious? And if they are, then it could be the case that all the footnotes that we have are footnotes to Plato meant for the hoi polloi, the exoteric teachings of Plato. We've all accepted them as the Platonism, when in fact, the actual Platonism was an esoteric doctrine, and we've all been writing footnotes to the exoteric doctrines of Plato. And we do know that the later Platonists, the Middle Platonists, do prioritize certain documents to be read. The Timaeus, of course, the Timaeus, the Republic, obviously, the Phaedrus, the Phaedrus, the Mania, the Theaetetus, the Phaedo, what happens to us when we die, the Philebus, and the Laws. The Laws are late Plato, and they read a lot like that seventh letter. Of course, also the Parmenides would be taken up especially by the Neo-Pythagoreans as the royal document of ontology. So again, when we get to Numenius and people like the Neo-Pythagoreans of this period, they will adopt the Pythagoras as the Parmenides as their core document, their statement of ontology. Regardless of all of this, Plato died. In 347 BCE, Plato dies, and it seems like by consensus, we don't have any evidence of a vote, the nephew of Plato via his sister Potone is elected to helm the academy, Speusippus. And it would break ultimately with Aristotle. Aristotle would take his toys and go home. He would eventually he was actually in Macedon when Plato died, Macedonia, and ultimately he's going to form a rival school, and that will be the Lyceum, and he will be arguing viciously against the inheritors of Plato in the form of the academy. And we can even see it in this famous mosaic of the academy. See, we have in the middle, we have Plato looking down, right, demiurge style, on this celestial sphere. He's lecturing about the celestial sphere, looking down upon it. Plato, and he's seated also, by the way, right? So Plato is seated, looking down at the celestial sphere as a demiurge himself. We have over here on the left, most scholars believe these are the eventual inheritors of the academy. Also seated here is probably Speusippus. So Speusippus will be the inheritor of the academy. But look who's over here skulking in the corner. This is very likely Aristotle, with his back turned to Plato, looking over his shoulder, still influenced by Plato, but now having turned his back on the academy with one foot literally kind of out the door. This is very famous fresco, a mosaic found at Pompeii. There's actually two versions of it, but I think this tells us almost everything we need to know about what the ancients thought about the early academy. Plato, Aristotle, 1 foot out the door, still holding his roll of books. Plato here lecturing demiurgically about the nature of the sphere, and his loyal disciples here, Speusippus and maybe Xenocrates, right, discussing the lecture. And it is to them we turn next. It is to that period, the Old Academy, one of the least understood periods in the history of philosophy, but again, the direct period in which we know Plato. These are the living heirs of Plato. They sat at his feet and learned from him. And it is to those footnotes, those earliest footnotes to Plato, that we must turn now. We must turn to Speusippus, we must turn to Xenocrates, and we must turn to Polemon, and we must turn to what kind of institution the academy was. And once we get the Old Academy under our belt, it is then we can dive straight in to Antiochus of Ascalon, because it will be Antiochus of Ascalon who will be the first character to say, in some sense, I am a Platonist. And these are the doctrines of Platonism. Fight me, bro. Antiochus of Ascalon will be our first Platonic dogmatist. But as we'll notice at the very beginning of the academy, there is a wild range of positions available. but they all share one thing in common. They all see themselves as defending Plato. They are the defenders of Plato, not the defenders of Platonism, but the intellectual inheritors and defenders. That's the word they use of Plato. And it is to those defenders, to the earliest defenders, to the old academy, that we will turn to in the next lecture.